The flickering image on the screen was grainy, distorted, a relic from a bygone era. It was a cold October night, the kind where the wind howled secrets and shadows danced in the corners of your eye. This wasn't just any footage, it was a piece of the past, a glimpse into a night that ended in unspeakable horror. The documentary, a macabre autopsy of the infamous Night Owls Halloween special of 1977, was our guide. The broadcast, they said, had been live. The terror, real. It all began with Jack Delroy, a charismatic but troubled man. A late-night talk show host, he was the ringmaster of Night Owls, a program that lived in the shadow of the mighty Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Jack, the man with the perfectly coiffed hair and the practiced smile, was a man consumed by ambition. His show was his world, his fame, his oxygen. But the world of late-night television was fickle, a savage beast that demanded constant feeding, and Jack found his ratings flagging. The pressure was mounting, the fear gnawing at his soul. Jack's world had crumbled when his wife, Madeline, succumbed to cancer. The laughter had faded from his life, replaced by the gnawing emptiness of loss. Night Owls went dark, a reflection of the void in Jack's heart. The show, like his life, was in a state of limbo. But ambition, like a virus, festers even in the darkest of places. Jack returned, but his spirit was changed, the darkness clinging to him like a shroud. He was desperate. He needed something to shake up the late-night landscape, something to reignite the spark, even if that meant playing with fire. And so, he conceived a special Halloween episode, a descent into the occult, a brush with the unknown. He brought together a motley crew of guests, each an expert in their own strange field. Christu, the self-proclaimed psychic, Carmichael Haig, the skeptic and former magician, and Dr. June Ross Mitchell, the parapsychologist, always on the hunt for a story that would make her famous. Her most recent fascination was Lilly D'Abo, a 13-year-old girl, a child with a vacant stare, a disturbing calmness and an unsettling history. The camera rolled. The studio audience, a sea of expectant faces, was buzzing with anticipation. The set was adorned with cobwebs and flickering candles, the atmosphere thick with a faux spookiness that felt a little too real. Jack, the consummate showman, was back, his smile a little too wide, a little too strained. He introduced his guests, the introductions echoing in the studio. Christu, the psychic, was a frail woman with haunted eyes. She spoke of energies, of unseen forces, of the veil between worlds. Her voice trembled like a violin string pulled taut, threatening to snap at any moment. Carmichael, the skeptic, scoffed. He was a man of logic, of reason, of concrete facts. He saw only charlatanism and trickery. He would expose them all. Dr. Ross Mitchell, on the other hand, was giddy, like a child with a new toy. She presented Lilly D'Abo, her face pale, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the studio walls. June presented her as the sole survivor of a mass suicide perpetrated by a satanic cult led by her father, Shandor D'Abo, a man obsessed with a demon called Abraxas. She was their prize, the focus of this morbid exploration into the dark arts. Lilly, they said, was possessed, and Jack, in his twisted ambition, wanted to showcase it for the ratings. The first sign was subtle, a shift in the air, a chilling breeze that seemed to slither through the studio. Christu, the psychic, had suddenly become pale, clutching her chest with a pained expression. She began muttering about someone called Minnie, a name that brought a look of anguish on Jack's face. Minnie, he admitted, was his pet name for his dead wife, Madeline. Her heart was pounding, and she found it hard to breathe. Christu's face went deathly pale, and she suddenly started to vomit, a thick, black, viscous liquid, like tar. She collapsed, a terrifying sound like a deflating balloon, and was rushed away to a hospital by the crew. The studio fell silent for a moment, and then continued. Jack, ever the professional, forced a smile and transitioned to the next segment, but something was clearly amiss. The focus shifted to Lilly. The music grew darker. The studio lights dimmed and Dr. Ross Mitchell introduced her with an almost manic glee, a glint in her eyes. She was ready to unveil the demon that dwelled within her. She convinced Lilly to conjure the demon within, the entity that Lilly called Mr. Wriggles. Lilly spoke in a monotone, a deadness in her eyes that had nothing of childhood innocence left to it. She stared, not at Jack, not at the audience, but into an unseen space, and started to speak. Then it happened. Lilly began to tremble, her body contorted, her voice shifting, deepening into a guttural rasp. It wasn't the voice of a child. It was the sound of something ancient, something vile, something that should never have spoken out loud. The demon spoke through her, its voice resonating with malevolent power, its words weaving a tapestry of dread. The demon talked to Jack, a low, mocking laugh escaping Lily's lips. It spoke of tall trees, a place that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. It was a clear reference to the Grove, an elite California camp that Jack frequented, a place where the wealthy and the powerful gathered for their secret rituals. The demon spoke of a deal, a bargain made in the shadows, a pact with the devil himself. The demon suggested that Jack had wanted Madeline out of the way. A silence gripped the studio. Was this a show or a genuine display of dark forces at play? The demon's words, they said, were a confession. Jack, it seemed, had sacrificed Madeline's soul in exchange for the success of Night Owls, a desperate act fueled by ambition and a twisted sense of self-preservation. He had indirectly caused her cancer through this dark pact. This was no longer a show. This was a descent into the abyss, a horrifying revelation of Jack's dark side and the supernatural forces that had wormed their way into his life. The commercial break was chaos. The crew was frantic. They had just witnessed something that defied explanation. The reports came back. Christy was dead. She had died in the ambulance from a massive hemorrhage. The black liquid, the ominous words, her death, it all came back and was too much to ignore. A sense of dread settled over the studio, a heavy weight that smothered any attempts at normalcy. They tried to continue, but the dark forces had already taken hold, and there was no turning back. They returned to the show, the energy shifting. It was a game, a dance with death and the demonic. Carmichael, the skeptic, attempted to regain control of the situation. He challenged June by attempting a hypnotism demonstration on Jack's sidekick, Gus McConnell. Carmichael used a pocket watch, the kind used in old-fashioned hypnotism, as a focus point for everyone's attention. As Gus's eyes glazed over, the studio suddenly seemed to change, the walls of the set twisting like a hallucination, the floor crawling with worms, a terrifying, writhing mass. The audience screamed. Jack himself fell back in his chair. The horror was palpable and real. They were all seeing the same thing, but when the crew rewound the footage, they saw no worms. The demonstration had been a hallucination, a mass delusion, an illusion that had gripped nearly everyone in the studio. The supernatural phenomena that had occurred during Lily's possession, on the other hand, was unaltered on the tape. It had been real, not an illusion, and it was caught on camera. The studio had been the location of a real demonic presence, a thing that had been conjured from the depths, and it remained in the recording as proof. Jack watched the replay with a mix of dread and morbid fascination, and he saw something else. In the background of the recording, he saw her. Madeline, her ghost, standing behind him, her face gaunt, her eyes filled with sorrow, the spectre of cancer still lingering on her pale skin. A chill went down Jack's spine, a cold grip of fear. He knew what this meant. This was no accident. This was hell breaking loose in his own studio. Carmichael, however, accused Jack of orchestrating the entire event, a desperate attempt to garner ratings. Lily was suddenly possessed again. The demon had returned, stronger than before, its influence permeating the studio, like a dark cloud, like a thick, evil fog. Her head split open, a gruesome sight, and the inside of her skull glowed like molten lava, a horrifying display of demonic power. Then it happened. She moved with unnatural speed. It was like watching a video in fast forward. She was a creature of pure evil. The studio turned into a slaughterhouse. Lily attacked with brutal ferocity, ripping into Gus, tearing at his flesh, turning him into a mangled mess of blood and bone. June tried to stop her, but Lily was too fast, too strong. She was torn apart, her body a bloody ruin. Carmichael, in a moment of panic, tried to run, but the demon pulled him back, its claws tearing through his flesh, his screams echoing in the studio before they died off with a sickening squish. The studio was a macabre scene, a nightmare made real. And then, Jack was transported. He was no longer in the studio. He was trapped in a surreal, nightmarish version of his show, a terrifying loop of past segments, echoes of laughter and applause mixing with the screams of his dead guests. He relived his moments of glory, his fleeting fame, the moments of laughter and joy, and the faces of guests now deceased. It was as if the demon was tormenting him with a replay of his life, mocking his ambition, his desperate deal with the devil. In the nightmare, he saw it all again. He remembered the dark ceremony at the grove, the chanting, the flames, the presents, the pact. He had sacrificed Madeline for his fame, for the success of his show. And now, the demon had come to collect its debt. Madeline's ghost appeared before him, her spectral form still racked with the pain of cancer. She begged Jack, her voice filled with a hollow sadness, to end her suffering. He found himself holding the Athen dagger from Lilly's former Satanic cult, the sharp edge of the knife reflecting the hellish glow of the dream. With trembling hands, he plunged the dagger into her spectral form, killing her again, ending her suffering, releasing her soul, but condemning his own. He had killed his own wife, the one person he had loved, not once but twice. And then, the dream broke, the surreal nightmare fading away. He was back in the studio, the cold reality of the massacre slamming into him with full force. He stood, frozen in horror, over the mangled, lifeless body of Lilly, the dagger clutched in his trembling hand. The realization was a cold, heavy hammer blow to his soul. He hadn't stabbed a ghost. He had murdered a child, live on national television. The police sirens grew louder, their wails piercing the silent studio. Jack stood there, a broken man, a murderer, his ambition finally leading him to the ultimate destruction. He was trapped in a web of his own making, his desperate thirst for fame having sealed his fate. The episode was over. The show had ended. The story, it seemed, had just begun. The documentary ends, the grainy images fading to black. The questions remain. What had really happened? Was it a mass hallucination, a demonic possession, or a combination of the two? They could not explain it all. They could not understand it. The world will never know. All they had was a recording, the proof of a real horror, and the silence, the haunting, lingering silence that remains. The silence that whispers that something evil has come to this world. It reminds us all that some pacts should never be made, that some doors should never be opened, that some secrets should never be uncovered, and that the world is a far more dangerous place than one may ever realize. The darkness is always there, waiting, just beyond the edge of the light. And it is in that darkness that the real horror begins.